A quick warning before we dive into today's episode. The content may be distressing for some listeners, as we'll be discussing sensitive topics including sexual assault, child abuse, and self-harm. Listener discretion is advised. Most of us have probably heard the name Emmett Till, a black 14-year-old boy who was brutally lynched and murdered in Mississippi in 1955. But what not as many people realize is the reason we know about Emmett's story is because of the heartbreaking courage of his mother, Mamie Till Mobley. After her son's death, despite the fact that his body was unrecognizable from the violence he'd endured, she insisted on a public, open casket funeral. "Let the world see what they did to my boy," she said. Pictures of Emmett's body were featured in national publications. Mamie Till Mobley traveled the country telling his story, refusing to let the world turn a blind eye to her grief. Her efforts are seen as a pivotal spark in the civil rights history, galvanizing awareness about the horrors Black Americans were suffering in the age of lynching, one of the darkest chapters in our nation's history. And to me, her story is a reminder of an enduring truth. There are few forces in this world more powerful than a grieving mother. I'm Leah Denton, and this is Psychotherapy, a show dedicated to providing survivors of therapy harm a platform to share their stories, and to offer language for those of us trying to make sense of our own experiences with the psycho in the therapist chair. This week, we're concluding the story of Leah Moses, another mother whose truth-telling and advocacy are fueled by profound grief. If you haven't listened to the last 2 episodes first, I hope you'll go back and start listening there. When we left off, Leah and her children had already endured years of prolonged family court saga as she tried to protect them from her wildly abusive ex-husband. She lived every day with a visceral fear for the safety of her kids. Despite all of the evidence Leah had presented the court, and despite the growing number of other women whose stories corroborated hers, so far her ex had not been held accountable in any way, and instead was allowed to skate through loopholes and blind spots of the court system. And it wasn't just other women Leah heard stories about. She also learned more about the inpatient centers her husband had worked at. Places that look reputable enough. Some even call themselves schools, but are far too often responsible for the over-medication and mistreatment of the kids they claim to serve. Leah had no doubt that her ex-husband was complicit in all of that, but there was never enough evidence. And even if there was, how hard could she push without endangering her children even more? If she tried to pursue legal or professional consequences for him, she knew he was fully capable of hurting the kids to punish her. The allegations and evidence would eventually become public. Stories of women, including clients, who'd reported being drugged and raped while in his care. One woman said he didn't even bother hiding his intentions, and told her directly that he could treat her PTSD by giving her drugs and having sex with her. The Utah Licensing Board had been informed about his history of domestic abuse, and the fact that he'd lied to them about soliciting a prostitute in the past. But so far, they hadn't seen fit to revoke his license. In fact, while Leah's life was day in and day out trauma and terror, his professional life was really thriving. By that point, he'd discovered therapeutic psychedelics, and that kick started the next phase of his career. This was around the time their divorce was finally official, and he was becoming more successful and renowned than ever. The idea of using psychedelics in therapy was starting to get more attention, and it was controversial in a lot of circles. But he ramped up his online presence, and he started flying around the country to speak at conferences and seminars on the topic of psychedelics.
Well, I think he thought of himself as a pioneer in the industry, really making change and breaking through that barrier of getting people who were in dire straits help with their mental health. And I'm sure he did all kinds of journeys. Well, the spillover into the family court arena was he was pro se at that time. And so now I have kids in elementary school and early junior high. And he's basically spilling it in these family court monologues about his right, his constitutional right to be a member of multiple churches, and within those religious organizations then have the ability to legally carry any kind of ceremonial drugs that he wanted. So we're talking about the ayahuasca, the peyote, all of that. So he became a member of apparently all these Native American churches and preying on cultural practice. He was deep into that.
The Religious Freedom Restoration Act was originally designed to protect Indigenous communities' rights to practice their traditions, including the use of sacred plant medicines like ayahuasca. However, Dr. Gandhi found a way to exploit these legal protections, and he's not alone. With the growing excitement around using psychedelics for their therapeutic potential, many practitioners, therapists, coaches, and even self-described gurus are jumping on the bandwagon. They're using these laws to sidestep FDA regulations and avoid the kind of oversight that ensures safety and accountability. And this opens the door for them to offer psychedelic treatments without the rigorous research and studies necessary to understand the full risks and benefits, all while profiting from these practices. The lack of proper safeguards not only leave participants vulnerable to misinformation and exploitation, but also makes them more susceptible to predatory figures like Dr. Gandhi. Not that experimenting with drugs was new for him. Even early in their marriage, Leah remembers seeing drawers and drawers full of expired medications. And he used to go around feigning symptoms to different doctors so he could get even more. By all indications, that behavior never went away, which became apparent when their family court ordeal entered into the next phase.
2021, Om is just in high school. He had been demanding this custody evaluation. So we had this big, long 2-year custody evaluation. The evaluator ended up being, I think, scared out of her mind to really report the truth. She and the guardian ad litem got together and they decided that it was going to be better to split the kids, which is very uncommon. And one of the only circumstances in which that ever happens is when a child is hurting another child. But of course, my kids couldn't be more loving toward each other. They were each other's rock and stability. It wasn't that the courts gave him full custody. It was that we had this mediation, and the custody evaluator, who is probably would have, besides the guardian ad litem, the strongest voice in recommending to the court what to order, recommended that we split. And some of the reasoning also was, well, we know that he has this sexual deviant behavior. And she disclosed many, many findings, like DCFS reports that I didn't even know, Child Protective Services reports that I didn't even know existed. And so with all of that, then it came to the point where I think it was so apparent and so obvious that who he was and this personality package that was so dangerous that the excuse was given, well, we don't know what he'll do if we take away both kids, so we got to give him something. And better not to give him the daughter who is now preteen when we know that he has had such deviant behavior. Let's give him the boy. The recommendation from the evaluator was that we split the kids, basically that I have full custody of my daughter, legal and physical, and that he have full custody of Om, legal and physical. That doesn't mean no parent time, it means full decision-making authority. And he had been trying to get this for years and years because we had 50-50 for so long. At that mediation, the evaluator let out that there were 9 pages of DEA medications, of which combinations could be lethal. And we went through all of that. It became very apparent to everyone that he was med seeking in all parts of the state from all different providers, from people who he had worked with and then, burned that bridge, and similar prescriptions in 2 different locations in the state on the same day, like all very, very, very obvious drug seeking and probably distributing.
So in 2021, after years of evaluations and hearings, then a 9-hour mediation session, the decision was made that Leah would have full legal and physical custody over her daughter, and her ex-husband would have full legal and physical custody of their son, Om. She would no longer have any decision-making authority about his life. And it's not that court officials were blind to what he was. It's that, in their eyes, there just wasn't enough evidence to do much about it. And state policies leaned heavily toward reunification, even if abuse was clearly a factor.
I knew for sure at that point that he wouldn't be free until he was 18. And even then, it would take years to unwind the damage that had already been done. But then to have a system, and basically I was backed into a corner because it was a mediation. I suppose I could have refused, but I was told over and over again, do not refuse this. You take this recommendation to court and he will win, and he could possibly win both of them if you deny the evaluator's recommendations. So do I take that chance, or do I get my daughter to safety? And basically Om sacrificed himself to save my daughter. And I told them at the end of that mediation very, very clearly, I wanted it to be on record, so to speak. You're asking me to sacrifice my son to save my daughter. Because I knew that Om would, with his personality, he was very much a caregiver, and he was trying to, now I know, save his dad from suicide and then save himself and who knows how many others from homicide. And if somehow that could have been said more clearly, then I would have done it. But I don't know how much more clear I could have been at telling these people who were in authority, who had the power and control to be able to give recommendations, you are asking me to sacrifice him.
I asked Leah how Om reacted to this decision, and the best way that she could describe it is that he was blank. He'd been bounced around between his parents his whole life, and he'd seen his father doing God knows what. Leah later learned that when, for example, the kids found their dad passed out on the stairs at home, he would threaten them if they told anyone. He'd make sure they never saw their mom again. So how else could Om react to this new development besides being blank? His lifetime in the courts gave him no reason to hope, and if he dared object or respond at all, who knows what his dad would do. Meanwhile, his dad continued growing his career, and more than ever, he seemed to be flaunting the fact that he was beyond consequences.
He had by then established an actual brick and mortar office with the whole ketamine treatment. This is also creepy. He had decorated the office with my artwork from many years before, and things that I hadn't seen, that I didn't know still existed. I thought he destroyed them all. He would do the souveniring thing, and that was apparent the whole time that I knew him. He would pull out messages, letters, all kinds of trinkets and things from past relationships. And I found out that those were from past assaults, of course. Yeah, I decorated the ketamine treatment office where he was drugging and raping clients with my artwork. That may seem like a really small thing, but psychologically, he made sure that the local business interview that he did for someone's podcast or someone's little blog or some website, we made sure that those were always visible so that if I ever found them, that it was a message to me of, you can't get away from me.
By this point, Leah's daughter had already been resisting having to spend time with her father. And Leah started learning how much more her ex's drug usage had been ramping up, to the point of needles left brazenly all over the house. She couldn't stop thinking about Om stuck in that house with his dad. So she called CPS once again, begging them to investigate. They came out to interview her daughter, and this time they seemed appropriately alarmed. But something must have changed their mind, because they never even went to check in on Om or to interview him. Meanwhile, another court evaluator was reviewing their case and working on a new report. Leah's ex had never stopped pushing for full custody of both kids, if for no other reason than he always needed something to hold over her head. And as each day passed, she could feel her son drifting further and further from her reach.
And I started seeing Om less at the end of that year. There was always some kind of excuse about school or something else. And now that I look back, I think that he was probably terrified to be away from his dad and in a place where he couldn't have eyes on him. Granted, I have to remember that his dad was all over the place, would travel whenever. I think Om was just alone. I think he was alone so much of the time. And he had his music and he was really strong academically. And so he would go to school. But I think that he was very much alone. And as time progressed throughout that year, and my daughter was going less and less to parent time, there were all these sporadic, strange things that were happening. So there were clues here and there that he was coming unglued. I had had so much experience in so many systems that I had very little hope that anyone would actually listen. I had Child Protective Services investigate. I was very, very forceful in my messaging to my attorneys, to the evaluator, to the guardian ad litem, like, you need to do something. I'm very concerned. This and this and this is strange. It's getting worse. I'm worried. And didn't interact with the kids or just didn't behave in a way that they were really that concerned. Maybe they had heard too much from me and this had gone on for so long that it was litigation fatigue, basically. I knew that something was different. I knew that something was changing. And I would not let it go. That was not unusual for me. This whole time I wouldn't let it go, but I think the more concerned I became, the stronger my language and the more frequent contact I would try to have with these decision makers. And then the custody evaluator put out her report in early 2023. It was, mom should have both kids. And there were dozens more pages of all kinds of other information that was heavily incriminating. I think even more than what had been presented in that verbal report the year before. I was so terrified seeing in print, in someone else's words, in a way that was organized not by me, that showed he was obviously not a safe parent. And we could think of many other labels too, but should not only not caregive children, but shouldn't be around children at all. And frankly was societal danger to himself and others. But it was shocking to me that there was no safety mechanism put in place before that report was released. It was just emailed out. To have that released along with what now I understand was incredibly ramped up drug use personally for him. And also there were other women, both clients and outside of his practice, who he had drugged and assaulted, who were coming forward and had a criminal case against him. And then to have Om there all of the time trying to save him. The last time that I saw Om was just after that report was released.
Finally, after all of these years, someone in the system had issued a formal report saying Leah's ex should not be responsible for the kids. They should both be with their mom. But again, like those early protective orders she'd fought for, it was just a piece of paper, just a recommendation, and try as she might, Leah could not get a hearing scheduled to address this new report. Nobody else seemed to recognize how deeply urgent this was. She was living on pins and needles, so close to securing Om's safety, but so terrified of how her ex might react.
The moment that I saw that she recommended I have both kids with me, it was like this overwhelming feeling of safety. A temporary feeling, but at least this feeling like everything that I have worked for so long, my main goal in life, more than anything else, more than any kind of financial stability, more than education for myself, not just self-care, but my own health, was not important to me at all. The only thing that I had ever in the forefront of my mind was the safety of my children. And finally, I had an authoritative figure who was giving a recommendation that the kid should be with me. I wanted that hearing so badly and fought and fought and fought. And again, my communication, my emails, my phone calls became just stronger and stronger language. Please help, do it now. Please do it now. I'm concerned. I'm very concerned. I don't think I could have expressed it in a stronger way. And then he was gone.
At every turn in this story, the system failed in its duty to serve the best interests of Leah and her children. Occasionally, certain individuals could see clearly what was going on, but they were constrained by red tape and the bureaucracy of family court. And when the last report finally offered the opportunity to do the right thing, it was emailed with no follow-up and no regard for safety. Even though anyone should have been able to put two and two together about what might happen, the possibility of Om's dad reacting violently was never in question.
I got a phone call from a past neighbor who didn't even live in that area anymore, where Om's dad lived, and she was yelling into the phone, "They're dead, they're dead." And this is just several weeks after that evaluation came out. I'm in the middle of hoping and working toward a hearing so that this thing can be put into motion, and then I can finally even see Om again, because he hadn't come for parent time in over a month. And what I have left is this voicemail that he left me that just says, "I love you, Mom. Talk to you soon." And that's the last time that I heard his voice. I remember the feeling of dropping him off at the train station, because he took a little light rail between our house and downtown, and then a little bus to get to his school. Early in the morning, I dropped him off, and he would never, ever, ever leave without saying that same thing. "I love you, Mom. I'll talk to you soon." And he closed the door and then hauled his backpack with the frozen big Ziploc of food that I had put in there, because I think he stopped eating very much. There was no food in the house. I think everything went to drugs. So I would send him with everything that I could. And he's hauling his backpack and his instrument and headed off to school. And it was 6:30 in the morning, and I said goodbye, and I never saw him again. And I think I didn't want to believe that call. In fact, I just handed the phone over, and I had probably about an hour from the time that I got that call until we were in the parking lot, where I learned that there's caution tape all around the house, that the police were searching for my daughter, who fortunately had been with me earlier that week. I had just a really overwhelming feeling that she should not go to parent time. There was a dinner that he had planned, and he was pushing and pushing and pushing. I was at work, and she was home, and she's like, "I don't know, should I go? He wants to pick me up." And I broke script like I had never done before and said, "You're not going, don't go." And I'm so grateful that I did, because I think his plans were much bigger than killing just himself and Om. So I didn't know all of the circumstances, and to be honest, I still haven't read the full police report. I can't, it's too much. I looked over at the detective's clipboard, and it said something about firearm, murder, and when we called Brent Hall, who is a guardian ad litem here in Utah, and he is, ironically, the chair of the Family Law Committee with the Utah State Bar Association. His answer was, "Oh, that couldn't have happened." He flat out refused to sort of believe it, and then said something that I will never forget. And he said, "Well, I guess that wraps up the family court issues." I don't know that I need to say any more, but you can imagine the feelings of a mother finding out that I didn't even know if I would be allowed to see Om ever again. I didn't know if his body was in a condition where we could even do any kind of viewing. I had little to no information. I just knew that it was confirmed that he was gone. And I was still in such a state of shock that even after driving away from talking with them, and I kept asking to go see him. can we just go? He's probably still alive. They probably made a mistake. Why didn't they take him to the hospital? Like, someone could have done something. We need to go and make sure that he's not just laying there, and maybe there's something else that we can do. And I think I replayed that over and over and over and over in my mind again and again.
A guardian ad litem is supposed to be the voice of the child's best interests, someone who ensures their safety and well-being. Them to respond to a child's murder with this calloused, almost joking remark, well, I guess that wraps up the family court issues, isn't just inappropriate. It's a fundamental betrayal of their role. Far too many times, Leah's desperate pleas were met by people who were doing the bare legal minimum for their job, or were maybe even more concerned about their own professional standing. And if the worst were to happen, which in this case it did, they were protected. There was no system of recourse or accountability for those whose oversight and inaction helped pave the way for Ohm's murder. They were officially immune from whatever might happen.
And the fact that this immunity creates no accountability, which means that kids are dying. I think before Ohm's murder, if you would have asked me if I thought that that could happen, I would have said yes. I was afraid that he would kill me. I always thought it would be me, because that's what he said. That's what he threatened. So he would accuse me all throughout the years of alienation. That's a common accusation in family court, misused and misconstrued, and usually hurts the child and the protective parent when that's used. But what's the ultimate alienation? Just take the kid. Just completely remove the possibility of a parent at all. And that was his long standing threat, because he knew the most important thing in my whole life was the safety of my children. And of course, that would be the threat. And in the end, he achieved it, much to hopefully the dismay of these decision makers, but I've never heard from anyone. And in fact, what's fascinating is that the attorney who represented him temporarily for that mediation, and I think just a little after that, heard the entire account that the custody evaluator gave. And certainly she couldn't give an entire account of what she found, because I think that the liability was too high. But her report, he heard the whole thing. And later on, he was one of the main points of opposition for the Keeping Children Safe from Family Violence Act, then named Ohm's Law after my son. But he was there at that mediation. He heard the report of the drugs, the assaults, the abuse. He heard all of that intensity, and yet still did not step in, totally advocated for his client, who I think he was probably discovering several facts during that mediation that he probably had not known, because he would stop and go off camera. And there were many times during those 9 hours we could tell that he had probably not realized what kind of client he had taken on. He later became one of the big opposers to the law, outright in the media, completely forefront, had no qualms. Scott Weiser. Scott Weiser. When it was found that he was trying to alter the law such that himself and other attorneys could use it to be able to continue to represent abusers, it came out. There were several reporters who used his name and confronted him, and he did not change his opinion. In fact, he had several conversations and was given many opportunities with the lawmakers as well to express his opinions. And he definitely used that moment for his own sort of fame. And yeah, it's shocking. I would think that anyone involved in a case where your client murdered their child, that you would have some kind of remorse. But no, in fact, it was the opposite.
No remorse, no accountability, which meant there was nothing to prevent something like this from destroying another family. Leah knew she had to do something. She already felt that deep sense of a calling to care for moms and their kids. And now she would do everything she could to help others avoid this fate. In the words of another grieving mother, "Let the world see what they did to my boy."
There's the tragedy. And I don't think in any conversation or circumstance or discussion, you can actually just take it and set it aside and then say, now we're going to talk about the hope. But my hope is that everything I do from here on out in advocacy recaptures my goal of keeping my children safe. The way that I can still parent Ohm is by doing everything I possibly can to advocate for policy and change that then could potentially save other kids. So the way that I learned about what became Ohm's Law was first Cadence Law. Having been on the board of the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition, a couple of years before that, and quietly, because I had to be very careful about my profile, I connected with them. Together, we presented this to 2 different lawmakers who actually were already on board because other constituents had come to them. And then we had our Senate sponsor, we had our House sponsor, and we were able to put things together and create a whole group of stakeholders, including other attorneys, legal aid, the lobbyist for the courts. And so it all worked out to be kind of an unusual situation that has not been able to happen in other states, where the right people at the right time all were together. We had the right narrative. We had Ohm's story through me, and it really all tied together in a way that was convincing and powerful. And I was able to testify in the judiciary committees of both houses. We had minors who stepped forward to testify who had experienced the trauma of family court. And as we went through these different protections, people started to, I think, take note. The media got a hold of it. There was just more and more that happened. And I think that with all of that movement, momentum, then that's why it was able to pass unanimously in our Senate. And then with just a few no votes in the House, and those were representatives who I think misunderstood and didn't know.
According to the Center for Judicial Excellence, from the years 2008 to 2023, 984 children in the U.S. were killed by an abusive parent during a divorce or separation. What would become known as Ohm's Law in Utah started out as something called Keeping Children Safe from Family Violence, otherwise known as Cadence Law, named for a Pennsylvania child who was murdered by her father in 2018, despite the fact that her mother had presented the court with extensive evidence of abuse. Cadence Law was a provision attached to a federal Violence Against Women's Act when it was reauthorized in 2022. And it's up to each state to enact some version of it. The measure compels judges and court officials to make child safety the number one factor in custody decisions, particularly when there is any evidence of domestic violence or child abuse. Leah had tried advocating for the law as soon as she heard about it, even before Ohm was killed. She had joined with a few other moms and met with Utah lawmakers, who expressed some interest. But at the time, there wasn't enough groundswell or support for the measure in Utah. That's the central tragedy of this story. Ohm's death would be the spark needed to pass the very law that might have saved his life.
But there was quite a bit of opposition, so strange. The opposition that came from Ohm's dad's own attorney, the opposition that came from the Utah Psychological Association, which was his professional community, who stepped forward and tried to stall at least, and tried to completely stop it, but we're not going to be able to. And the way that I think things worked out in the end of the session, and it passed on the very last day at the last moment, but it gave so many families hope. Implementation is a different story, and we're working on that. The administrative office of the courts are working on how to implement the judicial education that needs to happen. But overall, it gives protections for kids that didn't exist before in Utah.
As Leah started sharing her story and advocating more publicly, her grief and Ohm's memory became a rallying point for others who'd been harmed by the negligence of family court. After the unanimous state vote in favor of Ohm's Law last March, Leah received a standing ovation from Utah lawmakers for her testimony. And in September, when she was invited to the White House for an event honoring the 30th anniversary of the Violence Against Women's Act, that kind of validation, standing ovations, and trips to the White House, it can never bring Ohm back. But Leah knows it would make him proud. If you'd like to learn more about family court reform, whether you need resources yourself or you want to join the fight to protect survivors, Leah recommends checking out the National Family Violence Law Center at George Washington University and the National Safe Parents Organization. Through those groups, you should be able to learn more about the family court policies where you live, because they vary drastically state to state, and if there are any local efforts underway.
It depends on which state someone lives in, how they could be involved, and every state has a different political climate. So as far as making policy change, it's one way to make change. How change happens, some social movements move forward and succeed and others don't. And the only way that this will is with the voices of people who have lived experience. This is a civil rights issue for children. And we do not, even in the United States in 2024, treat children as if they're actual full citizens, with all incredible respect to what we consider historically the civil rights movement. I would say that we need to look at that and start patterning some of our activities and organization and behaviors after the most successful tenets of that movement, because that's really what this is. It's civil rights for children. I mean, this is the 100th anniversary of that very early Geneva Convention of the Rights of the Child. I feel like there is a place, though, for parents who have experienced this kind of loss. And yes, it's unusual. It's less common for our circumstance to have gone all the way to homicide, but there are so many that are living on the brink of, and that those are the children and families that I'm so concerned about. I feel a great responsibility to be able to share my story for the purpose of action. And it's becoming more and more clear what needs to happen. And one of the ways that we can take action is to try to pass Ohm's law, Cadence law, in every state we possibly can. At least that's a beginning. There's some place to turn pain around into progress.
Turning pain into progress is a powerful hope, and it's part of what keeps Leah moving forward. She has endured unimaginable horrors, and she says part of how she expresses her grief is taking action on behalf of other families. I am deeply, deeply grateful that she was willing to share her story with us. In addition to my gratitude to Leah Moses for sharing her story, I'd also like to thank our writer, Bo Denton, for his time and dedication, as well as our talented audio engineers at Peachtree Sound. Join us next time as we continue our series on harm in the family court system.